Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Heroic Mindset podcast, everyone. My name is Dr. Tom Davis, and I am here with my co-host, Larry Sunderland. And we are excited to really dive in today and talk to you about one of the things that we believe is an absolute game changer in the world of sports. And certainly, you see the greatest athletes in the world doing something different than everybody else. And that has to do with the heroic mindset. And we're really going to dig into that today. Larry, welcome back from Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where you still are.
Yep. Good to be here, Tom. Nice to be speaking with you again. How's everything in Spain?
Well, starting to change a little bit. So that's the good news. Today, 14-year-old kids and under were able to go out for a couple of hours. So it's not a lot, but there's some light at the end of the tunnel. And then also this morning they said that they're going to let adults start exercising May the 2nd. So we have hope.
Well, that's fantastic. It'll be nice to get out of the house, huh? And go for a long walk or a run down by the beach. I know not too terribly far from where you live. It's a great spot.
It's a mile and a half or two. And I think I've been joking that I'm going to run like Forrest Gump as soon as I'm able to do that on the first day.
Hey, you have to start somewhere.
That's exactly right. Exactly. So, Larry, we were talking about, this whole COVID thing has created a completely different mode for everybody. And I know some people, it's really taking a toll on more than others. And certainly with athletes. I mean, we have a house full of athletes. And you're surrounded, you have a house full of athletes as well, and obviously with all of the coaching you're doing. And I know there's so many issues as far as like mental health of an athlete, and how do you stay engaged? How do you keep your motivation levels up? And I read the article that was just recently from the MLS on some incredible things that you all were doing down at FC Cincinnati, and just wondered if you could walk us through that. What does that look like? And how are you keeping everybody engaged? And is there any training taking place? And if so, what does that look like? I'm really curious if you could give us a picture of that.
Sure. I think first when the lockdown occurred, we had to initially look at this from the coaching training aspect, right? How do we replace the training that's happening on the field in a new kind of virtual way? So we're doing a lot of stuff from the soccer specific end, related to, our principles and sub-principles, right? So we're allowing the players to take different matches that they've played in, examine those according to our principles and our sub-principles. Oftentimes we're doing it through our block training, whether it's our back line, our midfield block, or our front line. They're getting together. They're taking a piece of the game. They compare and contrast with the first team, compare and contrast with maybe a Champions League level match. And then they put a presentation together and come back to the staff and the rest of their teammates to discuss it. And then it's a group discussion. And it's been really enlightening to us because our academy is only 6 months old. We had our ideas on how we wanted to do things going into this back in August, and what we wanted to teach, what we wanted to coach. And this has been an awesome time now for us to kind of check on understanding, right? We were able to communicate with the players to see how well they're understanding our sub-principles and our principles. So it's been really good for us from that standpoint.
And are they engaged? I know that a lot of people have really been surprised about Zoom. I thought, gosh, to do Zoom over and over is going to be laborious and not very, very connected. But I think a lot of people are finding the opposite. What's it like with the team? Are they talking back and forth to each other? And is it some good conversation? What's that like?
Yeah, they really are. They've been engaged. It's fun. They have some banter. This idea of having, 20 some people up in a little square all over the screen where you can see each other.
Right.
The banter, it replaces, it's like I'll put it this way. It's like a little locker room on your screen. So you're beginning to get a little bit of that as people become more comfortable with Zoom. But from the actual educational standpoint, what I've noticed is they're sharing ideas with each other as they put these presentations together, and the presentations themselves are getting better. The content in the presentation is getting better, but the players are trying to find some unique ways to kind of spice up the presentations, which is really interesting to me.
And so you're also, I read in the article that you're also getting a bunch of different people involved, and you're having some guests come in, some pretty high profile guests. What kind of people are those who are coming in and talking?
Well, it's been really awesome. We started this mentorship program, right, with the first team players, where each player in a position in the academy had a Zoom conference with the players in the same position from the first team.
Yeah, they did something very similar to that here on my son's team at Espanol, just to give them something they would not ordinarily get to do like that.
Yeah, it's from both standpoints, from the developing players, the academy players, and the first team players. I think it's been a great exercise, and it's been happening all over the world. What we found was it led us to think about doing some things that maybe help to grow the person. So we decided we were going to start on this leadership project that's really it's taken off. Initially, we brought in Kiefer Sykes, a basketball player from the inner city of Chicago, and he told his story, and he has a documentary movie out on him, which was fantastic. And then we put together this 8-week program to have leaders from various fields of life come in and speak with the players. We have Landon Donovan coming in this week, actually, to speak with the players.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. And in the end, we'll kind of circle back. We'll summarize everything. The players will do some reports on what they found they liked. But we've also committed to making this an ongoing process. We've actually talked about maybe, introducing this as a whole within like the entire technical staff. It would be a really cool thing to just do this examination in leadership.
Right. So yeah, and that'll be a completely different kind of interaction for them. And then, gosh, to be able to learn from someone like Landon Donovan, and to be able to ask questions. I'm assuming that's interactive too. I mean, obviously they're teaching, but they're able to interact with them, right?
Yeah, interactive. What we're doing, Landon, is we've basically given the players kind of 5 buckets to focus on, and they've all researched Landon. For those that didn't already know a lot about Landon, there's a lot of material out there. So they've researched Landon pretty thoroughly, and we've given them 5 buckets to prepare their questions to keep the process moving, and it'll be very interactive. Knowing Landon, he's one of the most authentic athletes that you'll ever meet. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, when we do the podcast next week, then can't wait to hear about what that's like. You'll have to give us some inside information on what he taught and trained.
I'm looking forward to doing that. So, Tom, what's going on in Spain? How are things going there from kind of the football side of things? What are you hearing? What's happening with your boys and then life in general?
Yeah, I think a lot like what you're describing as far as soccer is concerned. They're trying to engage as much as they can on Zoom and different platforms like that, trying to make sure that the boys are out exercising, doing something. Now, the problem is we are very fortunate. We have a big terrace outside. So my son, who's 20, and he'll be going to Gonzaga this summer, and then my 14-year-old are able to go at each other, right? There's enough room. Of course, our neighbors' balls are flying all over the place, and they're having to throw the balls back because we're in this little community like square. And inside is where we have a terrace, and most people don't have that. So that's really one of the struggles, is you have a lot of these kids who they're not able to get out, they're not able to exercise. And so then the question is, well, what's that going to look like after 60 days? The good news of what I had mentioned in the beginning is they're starting to, let us out a little bit more, and we're hoping that there'll be some training, but there's not much else happening here. I think even today they're talking about a number of the states in the U.S. reopening, but that is not the case here. So, and I'm sure that'll really reflect on what we're going to talk about in the weeks ahead, certainly today, about this whole idea of mindset and how this will affect mindset. I think it'll be really interesting to see when you guys start going back, what the difference is, right, from being in confinement and disjointed all over. But I thought we could really jump into this, and maybe even because mindset might even be a more important topic now than ever, having been confined like we have been for so long. But we created this show, and we're going to be releasing all kinds of trainings and teachings once we get the website up. But I thought it'd be great for us to talk about this whole idea of the heroic mindset. And what is it? and what do we mean by the heroic mindset. And the idea is just to launch off into this. I was reading a book called Coaching Myths, and in that book, it was very definitive and said that 80% of success in sports is mental, and everything else is 20% of the equation. I've read other books that have even higher statistics than that. I know from what I teach, from a positive psychology standpoint, and a leadership perspective, that 90% of our success in life is determined by how our brain sees the world, right? So if you see things like, let's take an example from an athletic perspective. If athletes make mistakes and they see the mistake as personal, they see it that they're a mistake. I made a mistake. I am a mistake. And they can't get over it. And they blame and they point the finger, and they create this negative image of themselves. It's going to be really detrimental to them. But if they
defines them, doesn't it?
What's that?
It begins to define them.
It does. Yeah, they think that they are these mistakes, and the head game. I mean, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this from when you played professionally. But the head game is a strong game, right? I mean, we are constantly saying things about ourselves, and so mindset becomes incredibly important. But I'm wondering, like, how would you respond to that idea? That would you agree? Would you not agree that 80% of success in sports is mental?
Yeah, I would agree, Tom. I think I said it last week. It is the great accelerator. It's really the foundation. Yeah, it's the foundation that I think, as coaches, we think about the technical, tactical, physical, psychological aspect as kind of, sometimes you hear it as the four corners. In Europe, they talk about the four corners. In England, I tend to think of the psychological piece as the foundation, right? And as you grow that foundation, it's like a scaffold, right? The psychological piece can be a scaffold. And as you build that, it just raises the technical, tactical, and physical piece that much higher. And there's so many pieces to that we talk about: grit and resilience, determination, and it was funny when you were talking about your terrace a second ago, Tom, right? And a picture came to my mind, and knowing Gideon and Hudson, a picture came to my mind of these two players out there battling, and it's like it's a microcosm, right? But it's a mindset training ground right there. I know those 1v1s are going on, and there's so much happening there. And I see it with my kids. I mean, we've picked up spike ball, and that's our thing. Every night we have a spike ball tournament. And
spike ball, what is that?
So, it's like you have, maybe it's a 3-foot kind of circular, almost like a trampoline. And then you spike this ball and it rebounds off it in different directions. And you have two touches. It's with hands, and you have two touches. You set the ball with one, you spike it with the other, right? And so we have these matches, and you can see the different elements. I mean, my kids are different, right? My one kid, super competitive, and he gets really emotional about things, So
we won't mention any names of which one.
Yeah, we won't mention any names. And then my other kid is he's really clinical. He's really calm. He's very composed, and you can see he's always thinking through things, right? So on with my one child, I try to talk with him about, emotions, and managing your emotions are really, really important to mindset. You can't perform at your highest level if your emotions are getting the better of you. And then my other son, sometimes I talk to him about, well, perhaps I'd like to see a little more passion sometimes in you, and you're not so clinical. You're a little more free in what you do, right? So as coaches, how do we manage those aspects, and how do we create an environment where both those pieces in those two players, in that example, can grow?
Right. So I think we're in agreement then that the biggest element for athletes to work on is definitely their mindset. And, this idea of a heroic mindset is what does it look like to have a healthy mindset, right? What does it look like to have a mindset that sees failure not as a threat and as a personal affront that I'm a failure, but hey, failure is part of the game. now I'm going to be better, right? How you see the world. That's why this idea, 90% of your success in life is determined by how your brain sees the world. That is mindset. So since that's got so much research behind it, we have to pay attention to this as parents, as coaches, as athletes. I mean, it's the game changer for people. Now, there was a big video. Well, big, I say big because so many people have watched it. And it was on Robin van Persie, who was talking about this incident that he had with his 13-year-old son. And it was just fascinating because it's exactly what we're saying about mindset. And he actually was on there and he was talking about, he was just telling the story of how his son, they were playing Ajax, or I believe, and he didn't get to play. And so when he got in the car, Robin said that he was moody and disappointed and complaining and just going on and on, blaming this thing, blaming the coach, you know, insulting the coach, all this stuff. And Robin van Persie said, "But you sound like a loser. I mean, listen to what you're saying. You're blaming everybody, blaming the coach, blaming what's happening, blaming this, blaming that." He said, "I don't hear one single thing about yourself. I don't see where you're accepting responsibility, looking where you can improve, taking control of these situations." And he said in the video that this is what you should be thinking about the majority of the time, because this is what winners do. And he also said, you know, I didn't tell him what to think. I was just coaching him in this whole aspect of mindset. And I thought, you know, this is fascinating, because this is exactly why we are talking about what we're talking about, why we started this podcast, because mindset is that, as you say, a great accelerator. And so a lot of people will say, well, you know, is it nature or is it nurture? And I think there are some elements to it, but we certainly can cultivate our mindset no matter where we came from. But with this, with Robin van Persie, I mean, he arguably one of the best players in the world. Like, how do you react? When you heard that, like, what thoughts went through your head as a coach about what he was saying to his son?
It absolutely is fascinating to me. And it's so perfect because it happened in the car on the way home, right? Which
real life.
Oh man. And we hear about the famous car ride home, right? How
that doesn't go so well a lot of times.
Yeah, the famous car ride home can crush a player, you know? And so I think there's so many different elements to look at in this. And the one that intrigues me the most as a coach educator is what framework was laid prior to this conversation, the father and son, prior to this conversation, so that it could have such a great impact and positive impact on Robin's son, right? So you talk about all these things from the coach educator. How do we create this climate of trust, of safety, right? So that you can have these hard conversations and they don't backfire, right? Because I looked at this, Tom, and I said, okay, well, I love it. There's so much about it that I love. And I love the honesty and the truthfulness of it, right? But I also looked at it and I said, I was concerned. You have millions of coaches out there seeing this video and thinking, well, I'm going to grab this player and I'm going to tell him he's a loser and he needs to take control of this, right? And I'm like, whoa, that could backfire unless you have this foundation of trust and safety and caring, along with obviously competence and expertise, right? Which Robin has. But you need to create that environment maybe before you go to that next stage so that it can have this great result that his son found in the next match. And I think Robin used a great word. He played like a tiger. You know, I love that, right? So that was the thing that fascinated me most. And I hope that coaches out there understand, I suppose the context is probably a good word, right? You know, if I had tried something like this coming in as an assistant coach into a professional locker room and kind of called a player out like that without having a really good foundation, that backfires quick, right? So
Right. So yeah, culture, the cultural element, which I'm big on. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is from Peter Drucker, and he says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. right?
Yes.
So your culture has to be something that you are clear about, you're focused on, that you're intentional about. And I think many times we just hope or assume that culture is going to come alive, right? We don't build the culture. You and I have had some really great talks about that. But also, though, I think there's a couple elements here. I mean, one thing that stuck out to me too is that he was teaching his son not to blame other people, but to take what I call 100% responsibility, right?
Yes.
So it's not the fault of the coach, it's not the fault of the players, it's not the fault. No, because when you take that kind of a mindset, you give your power away,
Hmm.
right? So we all have to be careful of this in anything in life. That whenever we blame other people, circumstances, or things, we're in a victim mindset, right? We've taken the role of a victim. Think about that. Anytime you blame other people, circumstances, or things, you're taking the role of a victim, and you're giving your power away to those other things. And now
Mm.
you kind of let yourself off the hook, right? Well, I don't have to worry
Yeah.
about it. But now when the onus is on you, I am the man, right? I don't care what happened. I have to take 100% responsibility for this. Then it changes everything. This is where the heroic mindset comes into play. Now I start getting my power back, where I can now make definitive changes in my life. I can start coming up with solutions on what I could have done better. I can take an honest look at myself, right? I don't feel like my whole ego is on the line. I can say, okay, I didn't perform as well as I would have liked to in this area. Now, what do I need to do to improve? So that's the basis of this. But and I agree with you too on what you're saying. That what's the foundation that's been laid, is because if there's not trust, as you're saying, right? In order for there to be trust, there has to be safety. And so this is where when you get an environment that's negative, and if the players are insulting each other, or the coaches are insulting the players, or what a stupid thing you did on the field or whatever, and I know some of this is athletics, and this is the other thing I wanted to kind of prod you about, Larry, because this is where you have so much experience, is that on the field everything is about performance, right? So there's so much on the line that you feel like if you make a mistake as an athlete, you're going to be judged incredibly. Your parents are going to be mad at you. The coach is going to be mad. You might get benched if you're making too many mistakes, right? So on one side, it's almost like this fear of, oh my gosh, I better not make a mistake. And you certainly see this with youth sports, right? That they, instead of taking the risk, they don't learn to take the risk in the play. They just keep kicking it back to the goalie. That because there's so much uncertainty. So my question is, how do you take these highly competitive environments that you're in, and what are you doing to help shape the mindset, or even with what Robin van Persie was doing with his son, to create an environment of trust where you can speak the truth and people aren't offended?
I think you touched on something that's very, very important. In high performance environments, you're often judged by outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're judged by outcomes, often it becomes kind of an ego-centered environment, because if I win, that is who we spoke about before. That defines me, and that builds my ego based on the outcome.
Right.
So one of the things I think it's very important to do, and it's interesting. When I had the 17 national team, I had our first camp together. The 17 national team, the kind of the conclusion of the cycle is the World Cup, right?
Right.
And I wanted to talk to the players initially to make sure that they didn't come into the cycle with a feeling that they were going to be defined by that outcome. They were going to be defined by whether they won the World Cup or they didn't win the World Cup. I wanted their mindset to be more about the process and focusing on the steps along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And then really, really interesting, I wanted them to focus on their teammates more and less about themselves. Right.
Right.
And that idea of serving one another, and in return, you're served better yourself. Right. And I think that's part of a heroic mindset, is wanting to do well for others.
That you care more about your teammate on your right and your left than you do yourself.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I wouldn't. How do you do that in a highly competitive environment, right? Because you see all of this, right? The one who gets all of the attention is the kid who is the superstar. Clubs are built around these superstar players, and so I think there's coaches who do a great job of this, right? I certainly know from experience coaches who haven't, because their ego was too much involved. So when the team didn't win, they took it as a personal insult. Over
and that
here,
leads to blame.
yeah,
That leads to blame. And what does that do for the players?
exactly. So how do you cultivate that in team? And I know if you're talking with the U17s, you don't have as much time with them, but they're at Cincinnati even, or teams that you work with more. How do you get them to do that? How do they get their eyes off themselves when they've been told it's all about them their whole life, right? Which also, by the way, is the definition of a fixed mindset. So I think that the heroic mindset wants to encourage a growth mindset. And so a quick difference would be a fixed mindset would say the kind of coaching, as an example, that says, you're such a talented athlete. You're unbelievable out there on the field. When you're doing, you praise the talent instead of the effort, right? It's kind of like a kid in school who's like, oh, well, this kid always gets A's, and they get accolades for having A's. Oh, you're so smart. You're so brilliant. You're such an incredible student. But then what happens when they go to a harder school and they don't make good grades, right? Now they think, well, I'm not as smart. I must not have as much talent as I thought, right? And so a growth mindset wants to focus more on the effort, the hard work. It's this idea of what you see with great athletes, like what you hear the story of Kobe Bryant. He was constantly outworking everybody, right? He had this mindset that was completely different. He knew it was about the effort that he put in, the deliberate practice, and not his quote unquote incredible athletic ability. So how do you cultivate that with your teams?
I think one is, it's very important to have it front of mind and intentionally try to model it, right? And there are different things. I'll go back. Let's go back to the 17s for a second, because it's such a unique environment. You only get them for a snippet of time, right? So there's a lot of things you want to try to accomplish while you have them for a week or whatever it is. And so I had in mind that I wanted to begin to build this culture that enabled a mindset eventually of gratitude, right? Let's just say gratitude. And I made sure over and over again, I spoke about how grateful I was to be working with them, how grateful I was to be there with them, how grateful I was for my staff, right? What a wonderful opportunity.
You modeled it first.
I modeled it. Mm-hmm. And then I gave them, everybody got a journal. And we called it kind of our book of intentions. And what I asked them to do is I asked them every day to put down 2 things that they wanted to do that they thought would help build a positive culture within the team. And then I wanted them to write down 2 things that they witnessed that their teammates were doing to build this culture. And I said to them, it could be as simple as I witnessed Jimmy saying thank you to his teammate for helping, to collect the balls after training. Things like that, right? And
it had to be 100% positive.
It had to be positive. Mm-hmm. And we spoke about how we were going to build on that and try to build that to where it ends up showing on the field, right? And the idea of, we're going to all make mistakes. We're going to move beyond the mistakes. We're going to forgive the mistakes, because we've become this group that wants to help each other so much, and we're so grateful to be together.
Yeah, so you were clarifying what the culture looks like right out of the gate.
It was the first thing we did right out of the gate. X's and O's came after that.
Right. So you're very intentional then about what you want the culture to look like. You say you have these boys for like a week. And so you're not waiting for the culture to be defined. You're defining the culture as soon as you're together, right?
Yeah, immediately. It's the most important thing. And we also talk about the idea of, the buy-in process, right? And and how you cultivate the culture, every player doesn't initially buy in, right?
Right.
And I think the more the group begins to buy in, the greater the chance of those outliers coming on board. But I also made the point, and I think this is very important when you're dealing with a team, okay, that there are expiration dates, right? John Gordon talks about the energy bus, okay, and there are expiration dates to things, right? When people are just unwilling to be a part of the culture, there's an expiration date, because if you allow that unwillingness to fester, then your culture is really hard to develop.
Right. Right. So, I think you're hitting on an interesting point here, because what I hear you saying is that there's going to be a culture built no matter what you do. Right. Now, the unfortunate thing, and one of the things I teach is that as leaders or as athletes, you're in one of two places in life. You are either in the place of slow death, or you are in the place of deep change. Right. So you're either growing and learning and overcoming and improving, or you're slipping backwards. And the reason that that's true is because things don't stay constant, right?
Yeah.
If you don't establish what you want, if you're not intentional about the culture is going to be filled with all kinds of things: chaos, confusion,
The vacuum.
What's that?
The vacuum.
Yeah, the vacuum. Yeah, it's gonna be filled with something. And so I think that one of the things that you're saying, especially from a coaching perspective, is that coaches really need to be very clear and intentional about what they want their culture to look like and define it. Because if it's true that culture eats strategy for breakfast, then that's one of the most important things that you could ever build. And so if you're saying that the first thing you do with these boys on the national team is to define that culture, then wow, I mean, that's a pretty important thing that everybody really needs to be paying attention to. What does your culture look like, and is it the kind of culture that you want, that you're proud of, that you're making sure that you're enforcing?
So Tom, how would you begin to build the mindset, if culture is part of this foundation of the mindset? How do you begin to use this culture to grow a heroic mindset?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that's really interesting is that, so let's go back to the idea of mindset. 90% of our success in life is determined by how our brain sees the world, our mindset, right? Well, then you have to ask the question, where does mindset come from, right? Where does it come from? Well, it comes from two primary things, and those things are more subconscious than they are conscious, which are values and beliefs, right? My values. Who am I going to be when I step out on that field? What's important to me? My character, my integrity. What do I value above everything else? Is it teamwork? Is it connection? What is it? And what I found is that most people, Larry, they're not clear about their values. And so kind of like what you were talking about with culture, if you're not clear about culture, it gets filled with all kinds of other things. Same with values. So you have to really look at, okay, what are my core values as an athlete? Who am I going to choose to be as a coach? What are and these are things that, like, you want to be known for, right? You want people to say, Larry Sunderland, here's what you can guarantee that you're going to experience from a values perspective when he's coaching you, right? I mean, it's going to be an environment of excellence. It's going to be an environment of teamwork where we're for each other more than we're for ourselves. It's an environment of servanthood. Like, it's got to be very clear. And so I think that from a mindset perspective, one of the things I really encourage people to do is to be clear about your values. Be clear about knowing who you are. Now, we all have values and beliefs, whether we realize it or not, and they're formed all the way back in our childhood, right? So some of them, are kind of there without us even realizing it. But I think that from an athletic perspective and heroic mindset perspective, I have to clarify what values that I am going to choose to uphold no matter what happens to me. No matter if I succeed on the field, if I fail on the field, if the coach kicks me off the team, who am I going to be as an athlete? Right?
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I just kind of reflecting as you're talking about this, it's been an interesting for me personally. Um, I've gone both sides of that, right? Because
Mhm.
sometimes I've gotten dragged into it, even when the ego mindset, even when I don't want to, because the world I live in is so egocentric in a lot of ways, right? Um, so that's an interesting what you said. The idea of really knowing who you are is so important. Knowing who you are, knowing who you want to be, and then I also think um, understanding and forgiving yourself that you're going to slip. You
Absolutely.
know, it was really important for me personally to understand that. Yeah, I've been a person that I didn't want to be sometimes coaching, right, or on the field, um, and constantly reminding myself of who I want to be. And I think I encourage my coaches now to always think about that before they step on the field. You know, a quick reminder before you step on the field of what are your values? Why are you here? What do you want to accomplish?
Yeah, exactly. I think you find that the best leaders and the best athletes in the world are incredibly intentional about who they're going to be when they show up to practice, right? They spend time thinking about what result do I want to create here? What does this look like? They're not just depending on their performance, right? They're depending on motivating themselves and living their values in such a way that it's contagious, right? I mean, there's nothing like being around somebody who knows who they are. That's why we choose leaders, right? Because leaders are supposed to know the culture of the team, and they're supposed to encourage people in the right way, and they're supposed to be, that foresight, they have vision. They're telling people that they believe in them. I remember hearing a story about Sir Alex Ferguson, the famed coach of Manchester United, and I mean, they have more comeback wins. I think this is still true than any team in history, right? As a
Mhm.
club. And one of the things that they always taught is that that culture was all about believing in themselves, believing in each other, and believing that no matter what happened in the game, they could always win. And they trained for it. They trained that belief. It was one of their core values. And over, they would be, a goal or two behind with very little time left, and they would come back and win those games. And so that was something he chose to be very intentional about. Just like you're saying, you're choosing for them to be very intentional about this whole idea of gratitude. And I remember too, you also told me about, I don't know if it was that same team, but I remember you said that as part of it, helping them lead themselves and helping them kind of create this heroic mindset. We didn't call it that at the time, but I remember you also said you had them doing something else. You had them remember like when they played the very best before they went out on the field or
Yeah,
something like that. What was
yeah,
that?
that was actually with the under 16s, and that was our first team meeting with the under 16s. Um, I asked them each to recall their best performance and explain to each other what that was like, and not from the actual performance standpoint, but what the environment was like, what the coaches were like, what their teammates were like. When we came on some very, some common themes, right? Of it was positive on the sideline, it was encouraging. When I made a mistake on the field, my teammates lifted me up. So
Mm-hmm.
there were a lot of recurring themes there. And at the end of that meeting, we all agreed that we kind of were like, boy, that's not such a difficult environment to create, is it, guys? You
Mm-hmm.
know, as a coach, it's really not that hard for me to try to be positive with you as much as we possibly can, right? And with each other. So it was a similar exercise that I did with the 17s, but with the 16s, it was the first time they were together, and we wanted to talk about um, how they could perform at their highest and how we could support that. Yeah, and that was a great exercise. And when you were just talking about Manchester United, Tom, it was interesting to me that there is a recurring theme of mindset with all high performance organizations.
Mm-hmm.
you know
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you can hear about the superstar players within the organization on occasion, but usually it always comes back to this culture and mindset equation. When you think about the All Blacks, you
Mm-hmm.
talked about Manchester United, you go to things like the Navy SEALs, and it's culture and mindset that's cultivated in these high performing environments.
Right. Yeah. The
It's
All
no
Blacks,
accident.
and you mentioned the New Zealand All Blacks, the haka. I mean,
Yeah.
if that is not the greatest display of getting their mindset in the place that they want it before a game, I don't know what is.
Yeah, incredible. And I don't think these things are accidental. You know, I think these are developed with certainly with they're deliberate in the way these things are developed, and there is a purpose for everything they're trying to do.
So,
Intentional.
so let me ask you this question. I mean, you got a lot of years of coaching experience, but if you were to encourage coaches out there about this whole idea of culture and intentionality, being intentional about it and mindset, what percentage time should they spend on it? Because, you know, as I was talking about earlier, that most athletics is really about all the athletics, right? It's about the coach is spending time on the strategy, the tactics of the game, and then practice is all about, you know, all the athletic performance. How much time should they be spending? What would you suggest they do? From what you've learned, how do you balance those?
Boy, one, I would say as you're developing your training sessions, right? So as you're thinking about the technical, tactical, and physical, you integrate the psychological side of things with everything you do, right? And there are a lot of strategies to that, but I think you begin to develop those yourself as you think about something, right? So I would encourage coaches to think about the psychological aspect in everything they're doing with the player. If it is the foundation, it should be incorporated in everything. It should be thought about with connections to everything you're doing with the players on and off the field. It's critical.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I would say for the athlete, and then for the coach, but you've got to, if you're an athlete and you're spending 10 hours a week, let's say, in training, then you better be spending at least that much time on your mindset, on deciding what's important to you, who you're going to be. I call this is the aspect of something that I call elite grit development. It's the things you're talking about too, though. It's when was I my best? What was I doing on the field? What did that look like? Because if you can go back when you were brilliant in a play and your mind was in the right place, you were thinking clearly, everything was working, and you can go back and remember what you did to get yourself there, then you can repeat it. This is the idea of an anchor, right? So you got to be spending at least, I would say, the same amount of time on that. Who am I going to be?
I agree. And ultimately, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, ultimately, aren't you trying to get this in your subconscious all the time?
1,000%. It's something called reticular activation, actually, which is this idea that what you focus on long enough becomes reality, right? So your brain is sorting through thousands of bits of information all the time. I think we're making 35,000 decisions a day. We have 50,000 thoughts going through our mind a day. And so what we have to do is, and most of those are old habits of how our brain has learned to sort through information. And so, and in this culture, when you have young athletes who live in this age of distraction, where they're on so many video games and they're on Facebook, they're Instagram, TikTok, they're constantly distracted. And I'm not saying they should never do that, but they shouldn't be doing that at the expense of being intentional about their mindset and being intentional about how they're going to show up and focusing on their values and these kinds of things. So yeah, it is incredibly important how you build these things, because then when the pressure's on now and you do fail, well, then that's the difference between thinking you are a failure or that you just made a mistake and you're able to have resilience and bounce back fast, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean that is the missing component here, which is exactly why we're trying to put this podcast together and give people some real strategic ways of seeing things in a different light. So have you seen the new series out by Michael Jordan that just came out?
Yeah, can't wait to see it again tonight. 2 parts tonight.
Yeah, we'll watch it again tonight too. But I mean, he's another one. In fact, if you want a good book on this, I would suggest the book Mindset by Dr. Carol Dweck. Mm-hmm. And she actually talks about Michael Jordan there. You know, he was cut from his high school varsity team. So, and of course he was talented, but this is the whole thing, is that talent is one side of the equation. Now, he was uber talented, but also one of the hardest workers, but his mindset was in a completely different place. I don't know if you heard in the series, but he says, you know what? I just decided to turn it on, right? I mean, when he got into that mindset of I'm unstoppable, he was very intentional about it. I mean, he was unstoppable. That's what he did.
Yes.
So, Larry, I'm wondering, I could talk about this all day. I'm fascinated by this. I love this topic, and I do think that it's the game changer for coaches and for athletes. I mean, think of the numbers of times that you've seen a team and the coach on a sideline start to get negative. We talked a little bit about this last podcast, but I mean, even professional football coaches or college football coaches, you can see them start having a meltdown, and you see everything shifts. And there really is a spiral, right? That you can go in the direction where you're building on that momentum, or you can go quickly backwards, really, really fast. But just as we're closing here, what would you say are the most important things for coaches and athletes? What can they do to cultivate this heroic mindset? What are a few things that would be really important for them as they're, we still have time here, because we're confined for the time being. We're probably not going to get back to a normal routine. And so they have time to work on these things. What would you suggest they work on?
Well, I guess two things come to mind. One, take a really deep look at yourself, right? And I'll speak to the coach educators.
Okay.
Take a really deep look at yourself, really reflect. And through this lens, take a look through the lens of, am I a player developer or am I a player user? Right? So in other words, if I'm picking my team for the outcome on the weekend, if I'm picking my team to win the match, right, then I'm a player user. And often that can be a very ego-driven climate that's created by that. On the other hand, if I'm truly a player developer, then I'm looking at how each player within the collective can improve through the process. And part of the process happens to be a match on the weekend, right? So I think if you really take a look at, you kind of reflect on, which of those am I? Am I a player user? And is that what I'm supposed to be in the environment I'm currently working, right? And I would venture to say, if you're not coaching, a first or second division professional team, then you probably shouldn't be in the player user side of things. If you're working with children, you should probably be more of the player developer. So I would take a hard look at that and think about that from that lens, through that lens. And then I would also say, one other thing that you could do for yourself, for your players now, is begin to really think about the culture you want to create, and intentionally encourage that, intentionally model it, intentionally encourage it. And perhaps in this time that we have now, think of some exercises where you can begin to help your players to understand and realize what that is.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's brilliant. Makes a ton of sense. And I would say on that note, just a couple takeaways for athletes and leaders. An athlete's a leader, but leaders in general out there. That number one, I think you have to be very, very clear about who you're going to be and who you're going to show up as, right? So one of the things that I teach, and I'm very, very strong about, is something called a morning routine. We have something called, cognitive and emotional bandwidth, which just means that by the time the day goes on, like we lose our ability to think about the most important things. And so what happens is we get up in the morning and we check our phones, we get on our emails, and boom, right? We go into what's called fight or flight mode. And we have all this adrenaline and cortisol coursing through our body. And researchers say that if we aren't intentional about what's most important to us at the beginning of the day, we're going to lose the day. We will literally lose the day. But if you can take in the morning a morning routine and say, all right, who am I going to be? What are my values? How am I going to show up at training? How am I going to create the culture I want as a leader on my team? How am I going to show up with what's important to me, right? This is the heroic mindset. What am I going to do when I make a mistake, right? What am I going to do when somebody doesn't pass me the ball fast enough and I look stupid because I didn't come? How am I going to respond? So leaders that operate from this heroic mindset are intentional about who they're going to be before they're ever going to do it, right?
Okay.
So that's number one. Be clear about who you are, because if you're not clear, then as we talked earlier, that space is going to be filled with something you don't want,
I
and
love that.
it's
Yep.
probably going to be more ego and chaos. So you are the master of your own destiny, so to speak. So take it seriously and be clear about who you want to be and how you want to show up on the field. Number two, I would suggest to walk in this idea of the heroic mindset is that you have to become hyper aware of yourself, self-knowledge. Why do you do what you do? If you got mad on the field, you've got to figure out what's going on. Why am I so angry? And normally behind anger is fear, right? Because one of the things we're driven by more than anything is fear. Fear we won't perform, fear we'll look stupid, all kinds of reasons why. But you got to get to the root of why you're afraid. Well, I'm afraid that, and then you can actually come up with real solutions, and you can create a healthy mindset so that you're not overreacting. Because if you can't get a hold of your emotions on the field, you're sunk. So you have to be hyper aware of that. After you go to training, to immediately start writing in a journal. Okay, what went well? What didn't go well? How did I behave in a way that I'm proud of, and that was who I was, that did reflect my values? And how did I not? And what do I need to do to change? Right? This is the idea of continuous improvement that I'm a really big fan of. You don't have to make massive changes, but you have to make 1% incremental changes every day. How are you growing? How are you changing? How are you improving? So yeah, those two things is what I would suggest. Create some kind, doesn't have to be perfect, but create some kind of a morning routine about the things that are most important to you, because that engages the best side of your brain, which is called the neocortex. And you want to ask yourself, who do I want to be and what result do I want to create? Incredibly important, I think. All right,
I
closing
love
words,
that.
Larry. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just love what you said there, and I love the piece about these incremental changes. Just keep people going, right? It gives purpose. I love that.
Yeah, I think that what happens is that if you aren't intentional about making those small changes, then months go by, years go by, and you haven't changed your mindset and mentality a bit, right?
Yeah.
Because you could have been making those 1% incremental gains, and then you get a compound effect. Because if you do that every day over a period of time, that's going to really bear a ton of fruit in your life.
Yeah.
Well, Larry, this has been incredible. Thanks so much for all of your wisdom and for giving us an insight into what it looks like to coach a national team. And wow, I'm going to be really looking forward to next week to hear how it goes with Landon and to hear how the training is continuing. It seems like every week things are changing so fast anyway. So hopefully we'll have some really good reports and some good changes to where we can get back to life and soccer as normal.
Well, Tom, it's been a great opportunity to speak with you. And boy, I have a lot of notes here. I'm learning a lot speaking with you. So it's awesome to do this again, and look forward to next week.
Yeah, as am I. This is really stretching me, and I'm really, really enjoying it. And I hope our listeners are as well. So for those of you who want to get more connected with us on Facebook, we have a private Facebook group called The Heroic Mindset, where we'll be engaging with these topics week to week that we're talking about, and learning all kinds of things. We're going to be posting some coaching sheets in those in the Facebook group, and then eventually we'll do that on the web as well. But we'd love for you to join us over there at the Heroic Mindset Facebook group. And hey, we have this first podcast. We've been in 12 countries. I think it was 75 cities already. And so we're thankful that you're listening. We're thankful that you're in the same mentality and mindset that we are. And we just encourage you to subscribe, whether we're on the iTunes podcast, we're on Spotify, we're really all over now. And we really appreciate you taking the time to listen. We know that this is a community experience, right? That together we can learn, we can grow, we can change, and we can be the best athletes that we can be, the best coaches, the best leaders, and we can create a heroic mindset that is the game changer, because so much of our success in life comes from learning how to have the right mindset. So have a good week, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks again, Larry.